Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's Tuesday, and I say it. We're lucky. We're lucky this week. I say we're always lucky, but we're always lucky. So, knock on wood that our luck continues. But we're super lucky today. We've got a great friend and an author and a scholar. His name is Terry Anderson, and he's the John and Jean Deneau Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, and he participates in Hoover's Human Prosperity Project. He's recently written Adapt and Adept. The book is fantastic. It's a real piece of scholarly research, and it's all about the market responses to climate change. I won't steal his thunder, but we found Terry through Lance Gilliland, our co-head of M&A. These are two Montana cats that were just, I should say, two Montana bears, Terry, with some of that stuff going on in your office. But we're really, really lucky to have you, Terry. And Lance is going to do the introduction in a minute, but let me just pause up front and say thank you so much for joining.
Great pleasure on my part.
Well, Mike, we finally got that tanker out of the Suez Canal. Just a good old blockage. What else would you tell us in the markets? I know OPEC's got a meeting coming up. You've been thinking about some other things. Let it rip, buddy.
Yeah, thanks, Maynard. Yeah, well, we've been talking about this last few days about this tanker that was stuck in the Suez Gulf, and it kind of, they obviously pulled it out, but it kind of reminded us what was going on in the energy markets. Essentially, the markets were kind of stuck in a channel, to be honest with you. I mean, we've been going sideways for most of March, and the market's just trying to figure out where's crude prices going from here, what's the reopening going to look like. And that's kind of where we are right now. I think the market right now is trying to determine what the next trade is. We've been stuck in this pattern for a while. You've got basically a bunch of stimulus coming down the pike. With Biden talking about 2 trillion, 3 trillion, 4 trillion type stimulus plans. Rates have gone up from roughly 145 at the beginning of this month to 175 on the 10-year. The dollar's rallied back. And, Bitcoin is now at all-time highs and gold's going lower. So I think the market's telling you inflation is coming. It's getting worried. So that's good. That's actually going to be a real good setup for energy. The problem with that right now is you've had cases really start to pop up. You've heard the Biden administration talking about remasking, remandating masks. And, the question is do we need to start going back in these work from home stocks, tech stocks, or do we continue to stay in the cyclical and the value stocks? And I'd say what we're saying is this is a pause. The inflationary backdrop is back there. The supply and demand looks good. We think OPEC is going to continue to roll over their production cuts through May. And so the setup is really good. And I think what we're seeing here is that, all the global surplus that was built up from the pandemic is going to be gone in the second quarter. That's firm footing. That's going to allow OPEC to start to put barrels back on the water, and that's a great setup. And so I think, we've got a consolidation in energy, and so if you're sitting here and you're on the sidelines, you should be buying now because this is your opportunity for the next phase higher.
So, Mike, it was making the rounds last week, the quote from Doug Terreson. He's a respected energy watcher. Do you want to share that one with our audience?
Yeah, Doug and I are friends, and he's from Evercore ISI, and he basically is retiring after an illustrious career. And he made several big calls in his career. One of them was the golden age of refiners. Another one was a bullish call on crude oil. And his last days are today or tomorrow. And he said that within the next couple of years, the S&P energy sector will be almost 7% of the S&P. Right now, it's a little under 3%. So a doubling or a little bit more and a doubling from here. And his whole, thesis is that supply and demand is going to be good. Basically, energy companies are going to be very capital disciplined. They're going to be returning free cash flow. And this is something that they should have been doing over the last 10 years. They did not. They were in a phase of growing. They're not going to be in that phase anymore. They're going to be in the phase of returning cash flow. And that's what's going to, bring these institutional investors back to the stock. And so pretty bold call on the way out, but I think he's exactly right.
Well, I know he's, as you say, he's a friend of yours. He's a respected, well-regarded guy. So, Doug, if you're out there watching this, congrats on an awesome career. And I think Mike's got the invitation out to Doug to join us. So we've just formalized it here. We'll see if we can get him someday. But thanks, Mike. Okay, Matt, I think you've got the do less, make more speech was your pregame. Is that what you're going to convince us of today?
Yeah, Maynard, I think it's actually a great follow-on to Mike's comment there at the end, which is how do we get ourselves into another super cycle for crude oil? And I think one of the things you've seen from investors, and the biggest concern from clients, generally speaking, is that the U.S. is ultimately going to spoil party here in 2022 and 2023 with growth. So one of the reasons I think clients have gotten really comfortable with the macro backdrop in 2021 and was really the lack of growth out of the U.S., which allowed Saudi and OPEC to control the broader market. As we step out into 2022 and 23 at the moment, with the reinvestment ratios that the industry's laid out and with the growth programs that the industry's laid out, we're going to see about 500,000 barrels a day of U.S. supply hit the market on average over those 2 years. That satiates about 50% of global demand. So 11% of the supply stack is basically satiating 50% of global demand. And what we wrote up today was really just a piece around how, if the industry was actually to stay closer to maintenance capital for the next couple of years, allow Saudi and the UAE and a couple of countries that have been investing in spare capacity to actually utilize that spare capacity moving forward, that would create a higher structural crude price. It would cause less service cost inflation. It would allow the industry to actually be in a better position from a free cash flow perspective. And ultimately, it's going to lead to much higher equity prices over time. And I think one thing that really stood out as we were talking to clients was the fact that the cost curve in the US has become very flat. So we walked through on 2022, essentially stripping out hedges and stripping out dividends, what crude price most companies needed to solve for maintenance capital. And effectively, it's about $30 a barrel with a little bit of variation on each side. So unlike in 2014, when you had companies drilling plays like the TMS, you had small cap E&Ps with hyperbolic growth rates that led to high PDP declines. You had a lot of overhead and G&A that was in the corporate cost structure that really differentiated the cost curve. Today, that's all marginalized out. And I think the M&A and consolidation wave has been very helpful. The lack of growth has been very helpful. So that flat cost curve also, in our view, really allows for the industry to basically make the argument that for the most part, producers are on pretty level footing. And that footing should really be focused on maximizing margin and maximizing free cash flow. And in our view, our take is that effectively maintenance capital over the next couple of years will actually do that. It'll allow spare capacity within OPEC to be eaten up, and it will allow the back end of the curve to be bid. So that was the takeaway from the piece. We had some good feedback from long-only shareholders. It's exactly what they're looking for from the industry. And we'll distribute that. If anyone has interest in the work, we're happy to send that out.
So Matt, it's interesting, the way that you describe that piece, right? It's a message to the companies, but it's also a message to the investors. I mean, you mentioned the long only types that some of them responding really favorably, but don't we also need we don't need investors encouraging companies to speed up if your thesis is correct. So do you find yourself, you're not just communicating to the companies, you're communicating to the investors and saying, please don't whisper this in their ear because it won't be good for the overall picture. Is that a fair summary?
Well, I think at the end of the day, it really would be a reward for investors that have stuck with these stocks over the last 5 or 6 years with a lot of volatility. And quite frankly, when you look at the $90 or $100 case on crude oil, effectively the entire EV of our space could be taken out in the next 4 or 5 years. So it wouldn't be great for capital markets, but it would be great for management teams. It would be great for equity shareholders. It'd be great for debt shareholders. At the end of the day, it's a win-win solution really for the industry as a whole. And it's really predicated on having a sustainably high commodity backdrop. And we hear a lot of our peers talking about a super cycle. Our big one with the super cycle thesis is that the U.S. at that 5 or 6% growth rate, kind of pushing about 500 to 600 barrels a day of growth, put some competitive pressure into the market with OPEC. And OPEC may respond like we've seen in the past, which may be breaking ranks. So we just think probably the safest path forward, but it's something that we'll just have to keep an eye on, and we'll see how the market evolves.
Yeah, I guess where I was headed with all this is it's a big family in a weird way. The investors, the research analysts, and the companies, and collective consensus that this would be the best for the industry would be a good thing. So, okay, I'll stop talking about the family now. But thanks, Matt. That's good stuff. Well, let me get back to where I started. We've got a fantastic guest on today, Terry Anderson from Stanford, from the Hoover Institution, and we were alerted to Terry and given a chance to get Terry because our good friend and co-head of M&A here at TPH, longstanding TPHer, Lance Gilliland, knew him. And so, Lance, let me turn it over to you because you've got a great story about how you guys met and how we, came to be here today.
Yeah, thanks, Maynard. And I'm thrilled that we've got Terry on here. But in the pre-COVID days, the before times, if we call it, I was up on the ski hill in Montana, Bridger Bowl, and I was meeting my wife at the top of the list. So I get on the singles line, get in a chair, and I'm fortunate enough to be sitting next to Terry, and we're both wearing our helmets, so I can't really see him, can't see me. Start a conversation. I hear his background in economics with a focus on resources, his interest in free market environmentalism. And I'm trying to figure out what that really means. And does that mean he's on one side of the fence or the other? And so I tell him a story about a recent meeting I had with an oil major where, like we've all heard, they had tried to get some co-branded jackets from Patagonia, some fleeces. They were denied because they were an oil company. And so I shared that with Terry to sort of take his temperature. And we got a great laugh, a great chuckle on that for our 4-minute ride up to the top of the lift. And then, I had his name. I knew he was with Hoover, but that's all I really knew, and parted ways. Met up with my wife, Siri, and I said, met this great guy, and gave a little background. She said, yeah, really? I met a guy who had just moved here from Santa Cruz, California, with the goal to make Montana a hydrocarbon-free state by 2023. I told him to go back to California. So based upon that, I had to track down Terry. So I found his email, I tracked him down, told him the story, and we've been good friends ever since and shared a few days skiing. So great introduction to Terry. And, maybe to kick off, Terry, why don't you talk to us a little bit about this concept of free market environmentalism? It's one of those things that's been, you've been sort of a godfather of getting it going as a concept. So why don't you talk to us about what that means and how that leads to this climate discussion?
Well, thanks, Lance, and thanks to all of you for having me on the show. I've watched several episodes and just love it, and I tout it to many other people. And I also have to say, Lance and I have managed to get in a few more runs together this winter, so maybe a couple more if it's spring skiing. Free market environmentalism. I began thinking about resource economics in graduate school, actually, and I went to the University of Washington, and I've described my education there in 2 words. I learned quickly, incentives matter. And once I had that lens for the world, I kept asking, well, why does this happen, or why does that happen? And when you think about markets, they're all about incentives, and you think about the incentives they create, they're positive incentives. And then you compare that to political processes, and often it's negative incentives, and often with unintended or intended consequences that aren't very good. So it prompted me to focus on natural resource and environmental issues in a very, very different way. And ultimately, in 1991, a co-author, Don Leal, and I published a book called Free Market Environmentalism. And I can capture how well the book was received by a review that said free market environmentalism is an oxymoron, and the authors are the moron part. And I think it describes very well that, and people didn't think that you could take markets and the environment, put them together. They were at loggerheads. By the time we published the second volume, the Environmental Defense Fund, one of the lead groups in using lawsuits and politics, had changed its motto to finding ways that work. And I think that transition captures what free market environmentalism is about. How can we harness markets to solve environmental problems? And how can markets provide incentives for this to happen? And my latest edited book, as Maynard suggested in the introduction, is about market forces as they interface with climate change.
Well, Terry, thank you again, Lance, and thank you for grounding us, right there in the free market environmentalism thinking, because that's obviously exactly where your book goes. I think in no particular order, the book just talks about a handful of, big key concepts that lead you to draw your conclusions. And, I think one of the things that's striking is you got Mark Mills. You guys do a big discussion of hydrocarbons and our need for them. And so as we go through some of these building blocks of your overall argument, I think that's one place to start is, the discussion of hydrocarbons and just how important they are and how useful they are, and why investments in basic science should be used to supplement what we're going to do in the future. But, starting with those basic facts are really useful to thinking about this discussion. But let me let you to comment on that or take that anywhere you might want to, Terry.
A great starting point. And in fact, the lead chapter in the book is by Mark Mills. I know Mark's been on the program and he's been a longtime hero of mine. And I think the takeaway from Mark's work is that there is no way we can be a carbon-free world in any foreseeable future. And if we try to achieve that carbon freedom, it will come at such high cost that it will for all intents and purposes, slow the economy down, not just hurting people who are reasonably well off, but especially hurting the poor. Mark's point is simply to look at the percentage of energy that comes from hydrocarbons and compare it to what's expected from alternative energy, especially solar. And any rational person looks at these data and has to say, whoa, that is a steep mountain to climb. And so that's kind of the first point. Just, can we possibly make it? And then if you take the focus away from the US and put it onto the developing world, my favorite example is Africa. If you think people in Africa are going to somehow magically switch to solving all their energy problems and have economic growth with alternative energy, it's crazy. It's not going to happen. And then the second point, and I think this is really an important one, and it goes partly to your point, Maynard, about basic research. Mark points out that thanks to gravity, for example, the physics of energy use are such that we can have big gains early on, and we did with the internal combustion engine. The first engines that rolled off Ford's assembly line were far less efficient than my Ford F-250 truck engine. So we get a lot more output for less input as a result of that efficiency. But those efficiency gains in any kind of technology taper off quickly. And people who then point to wind and solar and say, oh, look at all the gains we've had, we're going to get more and more gains. Not going to happen. And the energy efficiency from wind and solar that we've achieved thus far is probably about as far as we'll ever get. And so we'll add another tiny percent here or there in the efficiency measures, but it's not going to be the be all and end all. The bottom line then is we aren't going to get carbon free. And if we're not going to be carbon free and we accept climate change, as I do, then what's the next step?
The other thing, Terry, in there that I thought was interesting is Mark talks about, we spend a lot of time talking about the cost of energy, but we don't really talk about the cost of available energy. And this is a big point, because we're usually talking past each other on how much does something cost, and we're forgetting that it's a really important feature to have it when you need it, dial it up and down, all of that stuff. It's obvious, but I just think he makes a really good case for how expensive expensive it is to have available energy.
Yeah, well, for people who live in Texas, I think they found out just how expensive that can be during the recent freeze. Available energy is what we care about. We flip on our light switch and we want it available now. And whether it's the freezing up of wind turbines or of natural gas pipelines, the fact of the matter is availability can change and can change dramatically. And back to the theme of the book, it's how do we adapt to the potential of these kinds of changes? What kinds of things can we use to adapt? And then there's another cost that I think is too often ignored, and is certainly being ignored in the political discussions of the day, and that is the cost to the economy of implementing these kinds of draconian changes suggested by the Paris Accord and others. And you know that it looks as though the trillions of dollars that we're going to spend and the efforts to reduce carbon emissions are going to reduce economic growth by a huge amount, 0.2 to 2% over the next century. And I think that's really important. But if we let economic growth take place, the estimates are that we'll have over 363% growth by mid-century. Well, even if global warming causes this 2% decline in GDP, we're going to be rich enough to take that into account in our daily lives. So I think this notion that somehow if we don't deal with climate change, we're going to have significant reductions in our GDP are nonsense. The significant reductions in GDP are going to come from the regulations and the nonsensical approaches that we've taken to climate change.
And Terry, it's probably, this is a good point, I think, to point out that, because if you're listening at home, which we hope you are here at some point, or at the office, back to the office, you're not making a case that global warming is not very real, that it's not very concerning, not at all. You're making the case, this thing is coming. These are my words, so you'll clean them up. This thing is coming. We now have choices on what to do. And, the world spends a lot of time talking about, let's lean in and do something about the amount of CO2 that's either already there or coming, daily. Or let's think more about adapting, which is really the thesis of your book. Let's start focusing on adapting to this thing that's coming. And you make a good case for why it would be hard to mitigate anyway, and why we might get some of those things wrong, and why markets have always been good at adaptation. So I need to stop talking now, but that's really, I wanted people to understand your mindset coming into this is, what are we going to do? We got a problem. What are we going to do?
Well, I'd have to admit that in the early days of these debates, I questioned how much temperatures were rising. I questioned how much the climate was changing, always adding that I'm not a climate scientist, and so I'm not really capable of analyzing the data the way a climate scientist might. By the same token, I also recognize that these predictions come out of models, and we economists have a saying about models, and that is garbage in, garbage out. And I worried that much of the climate modeling was garbage in, and that we were getting garbage out. I think we've refined the input and made the output better, and convinced me that the climate is changing. That said, it's not changing at nearly with the rapidity that's suggested by the numbers. For example, another one of your guests, Bjorn Lomborg, and a longtime friend of mine, sent me a piece today that he wrote, and I think this captures the way in which climate change is exaggerated in terms of its effect. The International Disaster Database shows that for the 2010s, the number of deaths caused by such things as wildfires, storms, heat, and so on was 18,357 globally. Now, you know, again, in the face of the pandemic, we kind of could say, oh, well, that's a trivial number, but okay, it's still big enough, and if you're one of the 18,000, it's an important number. But the fact of the matter is that if you look at the actual disaster deaths since the 1920s, they've declined by 96%. 96% reduction in those death rates. And if you go on and look at what they were actually not over the last decade, but just in 2020, the number of deaths was 8,000. Well, you know, again, I'm not poo-pooing the death counts, but only to say that it's not nearly as dramatic as most people on the side of climate change make it sound, on the side of we have to take action. The second point I would emphasize is that human history is a history of adaptation. And, you know, crossing the Bering Strait, migrating from Africa to Europe, all those are partly at least, and often mostly a response to climate change. So we've been doing this as human beings for a long time. And as my good friend Matt Ridley puts it, you know, he's rationally optimistic because human beings have the ability to adapt. And when we feel waves lapping at our toes and then our ankles and then our knees, we have enough sense to move to higher ground. And it's that kind of human ingenuity that is part of the adaptation to climate change.
Let me throw one more at you, and I'll ask Lance to jump in with his next thought. But there's a great quote in the book that I think it really resonates with energy people. At a conference, this was Jeff Immelt in 2008, made a comment, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And it was a comment about politics and, you know, when people go in the room and try to solve a problem, you know, who tends to get labeled the problem. So it's a great comment. But Terry, you in the book talk a lot about international agreements, politics, carbon taxes, and these are my words, not yours, but my summary is you express some serious skepticism around all of that because, you know, you do cost-benefit analysis, you look at a lot of different effects that show up in that type of thing, and it's one of the reasons why you come back to saying we should be spending money on adapting instead of some of these other things. But let me ask you to comment on that, particularly that comment about being at the table or otherwise you're on the menu.
Well, that comment from Jeff Immelt when he was CEO of General Electric came in response to a question I asked him about cap and trade and how much of the cap General Electric would get. I didn't put the words that he spouted when I asked the question because they wouldn't be appropriate for any audience. But I think they capture why I'm so skeptical about political solutions here. There's a well-known economic theory called the Bootleggers and Baptist theory, and it explains a lot in the world. And the theory derives from explaining why it is that many southern states had bans on liquor sales on Sundays. And the answer was that the Baptists didn't want people drinking on Sundays, and so they favored banning the sale of liquor. And then at the same time, the bootleggers who would sell liquor on Sunday said, this is great, now we won't have competition. And so the Baptists, if you will, carried the signs that were printed by the bootleggers saying that we needed to ban liquor sales. This applies so much to global warming. There are the Baptists out there, those who have taken global warming on in a with great religious fervor. And they are out in the front lines, chanting these data and suggesting we need to take these very dramatic steps. In the background are the bootleggers who win from many of these steps. If you're in the wind and solar industry, you must think that Biden is just the greatest thing to come along since Sugar Daddy. And Jeff Immelt's comment, I think, captures very much what this bootleggers and Baptist theory ends up with. Jeff Immelt and General Electric, they were at the menu. They were in Washington, D.C. They had their lobbyists on K Street, and they were going to benefit from cap and trade. As a result, they were the bootleggers. They're saying, we don't mind cap and trade. Anybody who thinks that a carbon tax is going to be revenue neutral and be somehow equitable, I think is just not focused. And there's a chapter in the book dealing with what Nobel laureate Ronald Coase called blackboard economics. And I think it's a really useful way to understand why the carbon tax is so bad. If I had a blackboard and behind me here, I'd stand up and draw the graphs of how you could impose the tax and get people to reduce their use of carbon, and wouldn't it be wonderful? And it's just this vertical shift in the supply curve, and it looks nice. And I taught economics this way many years, but I always added that who cares about this? Who's going to implement this perfect tax? And the answer is no one cares about efficiency in that context. They don't. They are the Jeff Immelts who are going to win from these kinds of things. I argued long times with my late colleague, Secretary Schultz, who favored a carbon tax. And I kept saying, but Secretary Schultz, what world do you live in where you think we're going to get the optimal carbon tax and have it be revenue neutral? And whether it's the carbon tax, cap and trade, the subsidies, all of these are cases of I think focusing on the blackboard and not looking, I like to put it, looking out the window at the real world. But then the real world is a special case for most economists.
Well, Terry, let me build a little bit on that and you make this point in your book about really, in many cases, the government just needs to get out of the way and let the market adapt, let people adapt to the coming reality, particularly given the policies that are being pursued will have virtually no impact. What's your outlook for how that ever happens, or how do we deal with this? Or are we doomed to spend trillions of dollars that are going to be wasted just to have to adapt anyways?
Oh boy, I wish I were more optimistic than I'm going to sound. I was once told that a philosopher is a person in search of truth and a cynic is one who has found it, and I fear I'm a cynic. I'm very cynical about getting the government out of the way. A couple of chapters in the book deal with this very issue, and take wildfires in California. It's just a classic example. You have the California government regulating the insurance industry in a way that requires that they sell insurance at last year's rates, knowing that this year those same properties are in the path of forthcoming wildfires. You can't have those kinds of regulations that distort the market and expect people to respond. If I have been, my wife and I live in a fire-prone area, we thinned the trees above our house because we know if we didn't, we are likely to have the fire closer. We adapted in a very practical kind of way. That said, if our insurance is subsidized, we have much less incentive to do that. So I wish I could be optimistic. I exchanged an email this morning with Mark Mills about this, and Mark said, well, I think we're racing towards a cliff, and the only question is how close we are. And if you can answer that question, you have a crystal ball that I'd like to have a part of. But I'm not optimistic of the government getting out of the way, but I think we have to keep hammering on the data, and to me that's an important part of that. And I think what goes on is too many people are pounding the table, is one way to think of it, with their we have to do something about climate change. So all of that, I think that I can do to help as an economist and as a scholar at the Hoover Institution is pound the data over and over, and hopefully some people will look at the data and recognize that that we're on a path towards that cliff, and we need to slow down and turn it around.
So Terry, one thing, and you mentioned Bjorn Lomborg. He was a guest and did a great job. We really enjoyed his conversation. And it shows up so much in your book too. You know, economics is grounded in cost-benefit analysis, and cost-benefit analysis at some level is grounded in intellectual honesty. What are we losing our ability? I mean, we've seen that the trillions and trillions coming out of Washington in the previous administration, and now this one. It's party agnostic. Everybody does it. We're not thinking anymore about what stuff costs. Has something really changed that's really worrisome? What do you think?
Oh, I mean, I think that's true across the board, whether it's how we dealt with COVID or how we're dealing with climate change. We just seem to ignore the costs. And part of it is just these costs are the budgetary costs are so huge. None of us can comprehend what $1.9 trillion is. You know, and there was a day when that would have been made the federal budget any year look trivial. But so I think we can't comprehend many of these costs. That said, if you're pounding the table, if you're one of those who is out there, if you're one of the Gretas out there, you know, protesting because we're burning carbon, hydrocarbons, then you're going to pound the table and you're not going to care about cost benefit analysis. And what Bjorn has done so effectively is shown that if we spent these trillions of dollars on other things, we would be helping humanity far more than we will by fighting climate change. And Bjorn notes well, and has had Nobel laureates join him in his campaign. He notes that things like malaria are far more of a concern to most people in the world, not those of us on this Zoom broadcast. But solving that problem is easily done if we would devote the resources to it. But we don't do that cost-benefit analysis, and I don't see much hope for that changing in the kind of political realm that we live in today, especially in Washington, D.C.
Well, I think the other thing that you talk about in the book in terms of efficiency, and you talk about local communities, right? It could be a state or a city, and you know, some of those communities are embracing, we're going to lead by example, and we're going to spend a lot of money, and we're going to reduce our carbon footprint here in our state, and we're going to lead and other people are going to follow. And then you contrast that with taking the same money and we're going to spend to, you know, maybe it's you put in a new infrastructure, or you do things that will accrue to the people in that state. Do you want to talk about that comparison? Because I think a lot of communities out there are asking, what are the right choices for us? And, you know, what should we be doing with our resources to help the problem?
Lance and I live in one of those communities, Bozeman, Montana, 50,000 people. And our carbon footprint is not even notable in any kind of measure. And yet our city is devoted to becoming carbon neutral by, correct me, Lance, I think 2035. And the kinds of proposals that are being put out are just crazy. I mean, it's not going to make us carbon neutral in the first place. In the second place, if it makes us carbon neutral, I can guarantee you that won't show up in any statistics derived by the International Panel on Climate Change. And then thirdly, if we're going to spend those resources in Bozeman, Montana on something that's important, we're worried here about housing shortages for the relatively poor people. You know, I'm not necessarily supporting that, but it makes a lot more sense than trying to become carbon neutral, which is just worshiping at this climate change altar. So, and then you can escalate that up. You can say, well, but if we do it in Bozeman, then we can get the neighboring town of Belgrade, and then finally Montana will be carbon neutral, and then Idaho, and then California, and then what? India, China. You know, that sort of lead by example, you know, probably a good thing in your household for teaching children to be kind to one another, but it's not going to solve any climate change issues.
Terry, you and I have had this debate on the chairlift about academia and the shift in terms of what's going on in university campuses over the last few decades and what may be causing it. Is there, well, if I ask that, you'll say no. What do you think is the prospect of the universities shifting to take a more constructive, critical role in this debate, or is that just a hopeless cause in your mind?
If I weren't sitting here with a bearskin behind me right now, I'd be in my office at the Hoover Institution. It's shut. The Stanford shut down tight as a drum still, and I have no idea when I'm likely to go back. If I were there and I held this book up in front of many of the faculty, most of the faculty there, they would have me brought before the faculty council as they have with some of my colleagues. Well-known author Victor Davis Hanson was brought before the faculty council and accused of causing the coup on the White House, on the Capitol. And it was simply because he'd written some good things about the Trump administration. I'm not going to debate the Trump administration vis-a-vis others, but it shows the lack of any kind of willingness to entertain discussions of data. And if it's that way at Stanford, it's that way across the board, probably. I have a co-author and good friend at the University of Wisconsin. He's a young professor, just got tenure. He's very worried about his career path because he thinks, well, he told me to stop using his edu email address and start using Gmail because he didn't want people knowing that he had somebody from the Hoover Institution of all places sending him emails. I mean, that's just a scary thought. That said, again, I come back and say, you know, I have a lot of faith in humanity, and the best part of humanity in my teaching career were those young people that were in my classes. And when a student would come up to me and say, well, that just makes common sense, I would say, gotcha. And I think the kinds of issues we're talking about with climate change here just make common sense. And that's why we need to keep pounding the data and showing the people the common sense ways of tackling this problem as opposed to the nonsense.
Well, it does seem like at college campuses, I was at college in the 80s, and I remember one of the famous stories in the 80s was that guy at Berkeley who insisted on going to classes naked. And it was a big discussion. But the reason I think back on that is the whole thing was grounded in what does an individual have a right to do? Like, it illustrated a mentality about an individual's freedom that universities, I think, in the traditional sense, always championed. The right to express your opinion, the right to disagree, the right to be free. And somehow we've toggled to this mindset around collective solving of problems and not believing in individuals as much as we used to. I don't know what happened, Terry, but I mainly just wanted to insert the discussion about the naked guy at Berkeley and see if anybody remembered that.
Only you made her.
Maybe we can get that guy to come on the show. There we go.
It's a
There's
scary
a challenge.
Well, let me take this on in a slightly different way. I think I wouldn't have been in education for my entire career if I didn't have some faith in people learning and in people coming to understand how to use data and how to pursue the scientific method. And I still have that perhaps even after nearly 50 years, a naivete about that. But I still have a faith that we can make progress. And coming back to the book at hand here, I think getting people to just better understand how asset markets work, how financial markets work, takes us a long ways toward getting them to start thinking in different ways. I listened to Matt and Michael before we started my session here, and I thought, I love listening to that, but a lot of people would say, what language are they speaking? And yet I think it's very, very important to understand the language that they were speaking translates into markets that are responding to variables that are part of climate change and finding the ways that work. So let me just one of my favorite examples, I think we may have talked about it on the chairlift, Lance, is derivatives in snow. Now, what a derivative in snow! I've actually met a guy who I asked him what he did, and he said, "Oh, I'm in the derivative markets." I said, "Do you know about snow derivatives?" And he said, "Nope, that's not one I know." But of course, there are many derivative markets. Snow derivatives are used by ski areas to deal with the variance in snowfall. Well, for all of you guys and most of your listeners, you're going to say, "Well, of course, that's the way." That's a way of dealing with variance and dealing with risk. And finance markets and insurance markets are a key to the global warming problem because they are all about variance and risk. They are you people, people in the firm are all about variance and risk. That's your lives. And most people never see those markets, so they don't quite get how important they are. The insurance market's one that's a little closer to home, and certainly the land market's one that's even closer yet. I know Lance had a wildfire burn close to his house this summer, and that kind of threat begins to open people's eyes to, should we build in these kind of places? Should we thin the trees, as I said we have done? And I think there again, it's a matter of continually telling these stories in the hopes that the person who says, well, that's just common sense, will carry the day.
Well, Terry, we maybe last thought, you've been very generous with your time, and we feel very lucky to join Lance in knowing you and calling you a friend. We're constantly talking to energy companies, big and small, all different parts of the chain. Most of the time they're classic energy companies. A lot of times they're, part of the new energy community. But how do you think the energy industry can improve this discussion, right? Because so many of them, they want to generate good returns. They want to be good corporate citizens. In classic energy, they feel maligned, frankly, unfairly. In new energy, the moods are a little better. But what would you say to that community about just how to really, really help the problem, make the debate better, get us to a better place?
Great question, and clearly an important part of this adapt and be adept issue. I guess one way is to illustrate the irony, hypocrisy, if you will, in much of the debate. And Lance mentioned in the introduction the point about illustrating that these companies like Patagonia that fight and spend lots of their profits even on fostering the climate change religion, have all their products made from hydrocarbons. And I think that, the raising that point and getting people to understand, hey, that nice Patagonia coat you're wearing wouldn't exist were it not for oil. So I think that's part of it. When people start to realize that and realize that if you really meant, I'm not going to have my Patagonia coat, I'd say, well, maybe I'll rethink climate change. I think the other thing is to keep people focused on how much cleaner our energy has gotten over time. I mean, we're not burning dung in open fires in our houses. We're burning natural gas, and that natural gas is virtually clean when it comes to thinking about carbon issues. And I think too often the energy industry gets defensive, and I can understand why you would. I mean, you have the new Secretary of Interior saying no more fracking and no oil and gas leasing on public lands and no pipelines. It makes you pretty defensive. But on the offensive side, I think continually hammering on the point that it's just gotten cleaner and cleaner and is likely to continue getting cleaner as we find new sources of energy. And I don't think it's going to be solar and wind that are going to be those new sources. I don't know what they'll be 100 years from now, but we won't be driving cars like what we call cars today. And I think pointing out, again, coming back to Matt Ridley's point, be rationally optimistic and look at what the trajectory of human history has gotten us. And that includes the energy industry. It is human ingenuity that has gotten us to the point where we're all basically rich. And I say that not knowing well I'm not Bill Gates, but we are rich and we have the wherewithal to worry about endangered species, to worry about how poor people might be affected by climate change. And so getting that focus of human ingenuity back into the equation, I think, is a key part of what the energy industry and all industry needs to do, what all people in the marketplace need to do.
Well, you just can't thank you enough, Terry. The book, again, Adapt and Be Adept. It's a great one. I wish we could spend more time on it, but we're going to encourage everybody to read it. It's a great read, and I think you do point out, we need more information in the market around all of these things so that companies and individual actors can make good choices, and people can express those choices in ways that improve the environment, which is, Lance, where you got us started, free market environmentalism. So, Terry, we can't thank you enough. Can you show us? You got to show the audience your room there. It's fantastic. The zoo. I think you said you've got
the quiet zoo.
Happy to do that. Before I do, I would encourage your audience to go to hoover.org, where you'll find a summary of the book. You'll find other essays. The policy ed group at hoover.org do a great job of putting these into very condensed videos. And I've done a couple of them on free market environmentalism, did one on just the fracks, looking at fracking and the facts associated with it a couple of years ago. So hoover.org, you'll find lots of this stuff there. With that said, here's what Maynard and Lance were talking about. You wondered what's behind me. It's my black bear from the Bridger Mountains behind Lance's house. Above that is a moose from Canada, and if I pan around, a muskox from Canada. And then we get into the Africa part over here with several animals from Africa. I could keep going. I'm surrounded by these animals, and a friend's daughter walked in the room and said, "This is a quiet zoo." It is a quiet zoo, and it represents a long passion of mine, archery hunting.
Well, if we can ever get up there, maybe Lance and I could come over with some bourbon and we'll tell some stories about that guy from Santa Cruz. He may be watching.
Oh, we have a deal.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Terry, and thanks to everybody. Lance, thanks for setting this up. We appreciate you.
See you on the slopes, Lance.